Nation, your boy Kyle, back in the driver's seat here on the Fantasy Headliners. Now, believe it or not, the fantasy playoffs are right around the corner. This season has gone so quickly, but I decided let's do a video breaking down the most difficult and the easiest schedules for each position. And we're going to try to determine, are there some guys maybe to go trade for if your trade deadline hasn't passed yet? Is there anybody on waivers that we should take a shot at right now? When we get into the playoffs, is there going to be any good streaming options, primarily like at the quarterback position? Those things are all going to be decided and talked about here in this video. Now, one thing I also want to remind everyone of is your standard fantasy leagues are typically going to do playoffs weeks 15, 16, and 17. They could differ a little bit. So if you're in a much larger league, maybe you'll get your playoffs started in week 14. I will tell you this though, if you play in a league with a week 18 championship, number one, leave it. It's garbage. Don't even think about doing that league again next year. Number two, if you're the commissioner that's doing that to your league, stop it. Stop putting people through that. If you like week 18 matchups, I'm going to need you to put the league down and give control to somebody else, because the only thing worse than that is allowing vetoes in your league. Now, with this video, when we talk about these difficult and easy matchups, this isn't necessarily oh, I've got a guy on the difficult schedule, I need to trade them right away. Absolutely not. Don't do that, especially with some of the studs that you're going to see coming up here. What it will help you prepare for is looking ahead. All right, maybe I need to anticipate that these guys are going to have a little bit more of a difficult matchup. They're not going to get maybe the points that I was hoping for, and because of that, I just need to have somebody that might give me a little bit better help in terms of upside at the other positions. So we've got a lot to go over here. Let's jump into it. Hit the like button for me. Subscribe if you're new here, and let's talk about the quarterback position first. Well, here are the top 5 players with the easiest quarterback schedule in the fantasy playoffs for weeks 15, 16, and 17. Number one name that you're going to see right there at the top, Jimmy Garoppolo. He gets the Seattle Seahawks, Washington Commanders, and the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, the numbers that you see on the easiest schedules, if they are in green like this, it would be they give up, like Seattle, the 13th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Washington gives up the 12th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, and the Raiders give up the 2nd most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Now, a number that's in yellow means right in the middle in terms of how many points they allow to that position. And then if you see a team in red like the Los Angeles Rams here, that means that they give up the 25th most fantasy points. So in other words, if you were to switch it around, like the 7th fewest. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody, and it will go backwards when we talk about the hardest schedules as well. I thought it might be a little bit more difficult for people to understand if I was going back and forth between the two, so I figured let's just use one set of numbers and go from there. So Jimmy Garoppolo, I mean, he's got a pretty decent matchup. Yes, Seattle has been tough at times in the passing game, but when you talk about a week 16 and a week 17 matchup, this is a guy that probably in a majority of leagues is on waivers right now between him and Marcus Mariota. And then at the very bottom, you've got Deshaun Watson, who is going up against Baltimore, who's 11th, the New Orleans Saints, who are 4th, and the Washington Commanders, who again are 12th, as we talked about here at the top. So we've got 3 guys on this list that quite possibly are going to be on waivers. So for those of you right now that play in one quarterback leagues, okay, you hear me talk about this all the time. Jake talks about it all the time as well. What is one thing that we typically don't do? It's carry 2 quarterbacks in a 1 quarterback league. However, there becomes a time in the season where you look at your schedule and you decide, especially as you're moving towards the playoffs, do I pick up a second quarterback, somebody that might have an easier playoff schedule that I can play at that time? We are reaching the precipice that we need to start thinking about carrying a second quarterback if we don't have one of those top tier guys. And Jimmy Garoppolo, Marcus Mariota, and Deshaun Watson all are going to fall into that category. We are going to need to put ourselves in a position where, yeah, maybe if you do have a guy with a more difficult quarterback, and you know what? My apologies, I'm just noticing Deshaun Watson's name is incorrect. It's Deshaun, and I accidentally put a W. So my apologies to Deshaun Watson. That's supposed to be a U. But with that being said, we've got to look at, okay, Jimmy Garoppolo, Marcus Mariota, Watson. Maybe they're out there. Maybe they're available. Do you grab them right now? We're getting a little bit closer to that. Now, Aaron Rodgers, obviously, we're going to talk about Marcus Mariota and Lamar Jackson in a second, but let's go to Aaron Rodgers first. 25th most points. LA is going to be a little bit of a tougher matchup for him, especially if they have any more injuries on the offensive line. And then you're going to see, Aaron Donald really getting in the face of Aaron Rodgers. And when those types of things happen, yeah, week 15 could be a tough matchup. So if you own Aaron Rodgers and you've been using him this season, maybe you do grab a guy like Marcus Mariota, and then in week 15 you play Mariota, and then you go back to Rodgers when he gets the Miami Dolphins, the third most points to quarterbacks, and then championship week when he gets the Vikings, ninth most fantasy points to quarterbacks. What about a Lamar Jackson? I know there's a lot of people that are frustrated with Lamar Jackson right now. He's had some inconsistent games, losing Rashad Bateman, losing Marquise Brown. Those two things have been issues. And when I say losing, I mean he was traded. I don't want anyone to be like, Kyle, Marquise Brown isn't with him anymore, because I may have accidentally said that a couple of weeks ago. But anyway, Marquise Brown, obviously, he was traded this offseason, so he lost his number one target. His other number one target for this season, Rashad Bateman, he goes down with an injury. Mark Andrews has been beat up, and the run game has been hurt again as well, with J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards continuing to miss time on and off. So we found ourselves with a Lamar Jackson that just doesn't have the oomph that he has had in the past. But then when you get to like a week 16 and a week 17, when we go against the Atlanta Falcons and the Pittsburgh Steelers, we are absolutely going to be rolling him out there for those matchups. Now, Cleveland, you take a look at a game like Cleveland and like Pittsburgh, when you've got really good pass rushers like a Myles Garrett, like a TJ Watt, when you've got guys like that, it doesn't worry me as much about Lamar Jackson, because he can get out of the pocket. He can escape. He can move away from those things. So when you take a look at those type of things, you're like, Kyle, are we worried about that at all? I'm not with a guy like Lamar Jackson. One thing I want to note with Marcus Mariota, okay? One of the things that we've seen him allow a little bit of upside this season is his feet and what he does on the ground with his legs. Now, they've started to kick it up a notch a little bit here over the last couple of weeks, actually throwing the football, which is good to see. But one thing I want to make note of, yes, you've got Baltimore sitting in there 11th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Not only does New Orleans allow the 4th most and the Arizona Cardinals allow the 6th most, but New Orleans and Arizona are also in the top 10 of most rushing yards allowed to quarterbacks. There is a really good chance that Marcus Mariota is going to win some fantasy leagues for those out there. Hardest QB playoff schedules. Let's talk about that now. Matthew Stafford is going to have a gauntlet. Green Bay allows the 9th fewest. The Denver Broncos allow the 2nd fewest. The Los Angeles Chargers allow the 11th fewest. So like I mentioned, now that we're talking about the hardest schedules, we're talking about the fewest fantasy points allowed. So we're going opposite of what we were doing for the easiest points. So this is going to be a really tough matchup. A guy like Matthew Stafford, he's not a guy that a lot of you were probably relying on anyway. If you were, you may have moved on already. But this is one of those instances where you own maybe a Matthew Stafford, we're grabbing a Marcus Mariota, we're grabbing a Jimmy Garoppolo, we're grabbing somebody knowing that we're probably going to need to utilize them because the matchups coming in are awful. Tua's an interesting one. He gets Buffalo, who allows the fewest, Green Bay that allows the 9th fewest, and the New York Jets that allow the 10th fewest. We know that we are going to have some tough matchups here. For me, for Tua, we're going to have to be ready for that in the playoffs, but we're probably not sitting him because he's got Tyreek Hill. He's got Jalen Waddle. He's got guys that can win all over the field at any level of the field. It's going to be hard for me to sit Tua for a guy like a Marcus Mariota, right? Because of how good he has been this season. A guy like, Patrick Mahomes, a guy like Justin Herbert, Joe Burrow, guys that are really, really good and we've seen perform at high levels this season, it will be tough to sit them. But for those of you that have been, relying on guys like a Matthew Stafford, maybe like a Kirk Cousins or a Trevor Lawrence, two guys that you see here that also have extremely tough matchups coming up. Those are all things that we need to be worried about. Now, I am just noticing as well, and I apologize, some of the colors are off on the right-hand side there. So when we take a look at a guy like Justin Fields, he's got a really good Week 17 matchup, based on what we've seen him do against Detroit before, right? Detroit allows the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So the reason you see a 32 there, it should be green. The reason you see a 32 there is because they've allowed that many fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. They have allowed the most. And again, we're going backwards now. So hopefully you're listening and understanding all this and not just looking at the slides like some people tend to do. But when you take a look at that, Justin Fields against Philly and against Buffalo, I don't know if we can trust him in those 2 weeks. I know he has been absolutely fantastic, and I know he's winning matchups single-handedly for people right now. But if you have like a Justin Fields, I'm going with Marcus Mariota in week 15 and 16 over Justin Fields, and I'll come back to him in week 17 against Detroit. Trevor Lawrence, another guy that maybe you've been relying on this year, but he's not a guy that you're tied to. So he's a guy that we could dump and maybe go for one of these other guys with a much easier schedule. Let's go ahead and move over to the running back position. At the running back position, Alvin Kamara is actually going to have a really good schedule. And I know there's a lot of people that are frustrated with him right now, and I understand why. Alvin Kamara, to me, is not a guy that I want to give up on just yet. He's going to have Atlanta and he's going to have the Cleveland Browns, both in the top 6 of most fantasy points allowed. Now, week 17, we're going to get Philadelphia. Philadelphia, obviously a lot better, but I'm not ready to move on from Alvin Kamara just because of the way he's performed so far. My hope is that against Atlanta and against Cleveland, he gets out there and he absolutely goes crazy and he helps us get to the fantasy championship, and then we can figure out something from there. The Detroit running backs, they're going to have a little bit of a tougher matchup. The New York Jets right in the middle in terms of most fantasy points allowed to running back. So when we go to week 15, a Jamal Williams, a DeAndre Swift, maybe they're not nearly as enticing to us. But hopefully DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams are not guys that you have greatly relied on. But in week 16, they get the Carolina Panthers, who have been absolutely shredded this season by running backs. Jamal Williams going up against Carolina should be an easy start that week. Going up against Chicago, he's a guy scored against Chicago. We'll probably be starting him at that point as well. Both of those guys, DeAndre Swift going against the Jets, he might actually be a pretty good player to utilize then because of how tough the matchups are going to be for the wide receivers. Now we get some dump-offs there to DeAndre Swift, and he's the guy that helps us in week 15. Jamal Williams back in week 16 and 17 to really help us smash the championships there. Derrick Henry, he gets the Chargers and the Houston Texans. If you've got Derrick Henry on your team, you can expect some gigantic performances the first 2 weeks of the playoffs, and then he gets the Dallas Cowboys in week 17. They allow the 24th most, so then the schedule gets a little bit more difficult for him. Najee Harris, we saw him this past week and finally have that type of game that people were hoping for this season. He finally looks pretty good. He gets Carolina just like Detroit does the week after. He's going to get the Las Vegas Raiders, 5th most fantasy points, 4th most fantasy points, and a little bit more difficult matchup against Baltimore in week 17. But like I say, just get me to the playoffs. And then when I get to the playoffs, I say, hey, just get me to the next round. Get me to the next round. I'll worry about the next round when I get there. But I know Najee Harris is going to be a guy we'll start in week 15 and 16 with good matchups. The San Francisco running backs, Christian McCaffrey and Elijah Mitchell. Yes, they might have a tough week 16 matchup, but we're going to have smash matchups against Seattle and Las Vegas in week 15 and 17. Now, Jake did a trade targets video at the end of last week. He talked about Elijah Mitchell, and I 100% agree with him. You might be grabbing Elijah Mitchell, not because you're going to utilize him every single week, but he's a guy that you can throw out there if CMC gets banged up, especially towards the end of the season when we know that, hey, if CMC is, limping through with any type of an injury or they're wanting to keep him healthy for the playoffs, Elijah Mitchell is going to get more carries. Seattle is a game that might be a little bit more on the tougher side, but if they can get out to a lead, we'll probably see a good amount of Elijah Mitchell. Washington could end up being the same way. Las Vegas will definitely be that way. If they can get out to any type of a lead on, did I say Las Vegas? Yeah, Las Vegas. I thought I said Los Angeles for a second, but the Las Vegas Raiders, get out on them, and that's also going to be a good matchup for you. So these guys right here are ones that we should target for a good playoff schedule. Let's reverse the numbers again and talk about the hardest running back schedules now. We've got some studs that are going to have awful playoff schedules. And this is why at the beginning of the video, I wanted to point out to everybody that this isn't necessarily a trade this player now type of video. So Jacobs, who quite arguably has the worst schedule of everybody, Joe Mixon, who's a very close second, Nick Chubb, Saquon Barkley, and Kenneth Walker are all going to be in this realm of lower upside come the playoffs. Now, Josh Jacobs, not necessarily Nick Chubb, because yes, he's got more difficult matchups, but they're not the matchups that I look at and say, oh my God, he's screwed. These matchups, when we take a look at them, it's more like the upside could be lower, but we need to really hope that, he just has a good week. But my issue with Josh Jacobs and Saquon Barkley is that they are so reliant on any type of production on the ground that if they're getting shut out on the ground, they're not going to offer you anything through the air. Joe Mixon might be able to help out a little bit. Now, he is in the concussion protocol, unfortunately. I believe he left in the second quarter of the game this past week. Samaje Perine was able to jump in there. So if you're watching this video first thing in the morning, this will actually come out before the waiver wire video. If Samaje Perine is on your waiver wire, grab him right now. 3 receiving touchdowns. They're getting the running backs. We saw it 2 weeks ago. We saw it this week with Perine. They're getting the running backs involved in the game plan more now. And I think that was absolutely terrific and something that we've talked about in our videos this season is getting them going. But Joe Mixon, obviously, if he's back and healthy, he's the guy that is going to see a little bit more targets. I mean, we saw in, if you remember, my dynamic running back update video that I did the other day, you saw me break down what his numbers have been. He's actually looking good in terms of receptions and receiving yards this year. It's something that is a little bit more intriguing to him than it has been in years past because he is using those points a little bit better this season than what we've seen. So Joe Mixon, we get a little bit better of an opportunity there because maybe he's held to some lower standards on the ground, but if he can add 30, 40 yards through the air, 5 or 6 receptions or something like that, 4 receptions even, those are all points right there that could really help out towards his final score. Kenneth Walker, he'll be tough as well. He's going to be tough. Not nearly used in the passing game, the way some of the other, like an Austin Eckler might be. So again, he's kind of another situation where it's like, we really got to hope for touchdowns here. Like Nick Chubb, Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, Kenneth Walker, we are hoping for touchdowns. If we can get touchdowns, great. If we don't get them, it is going to be difficult. Now, should you trade any of these players? No. I am not telling you to go trade any of these players because the problem with that is unless you're going to get high-end players back, you're going to put yourself in a position where now you're struggling at the running back position the rest of the year. So don't trade any of these guys for like 2 players and you get a lesser running back in return just because he's got an easier schedule. Don't do anything stupid like that. You could really hurt your roster by freaking out just based on this. Again, the whole point of this is to plan ahead. If you know these guys are going to be a little bit lower in terms of what you can expect, look at the quarterback position, the wide receiver and tight end position, and find some guys for week 15, 16, and 17 that have a little bit more upside that you can utilize to help balance it out for you. Let's talk about some wide receivers. We've got a few guys with some decent options here, but how many of them are true league winners, I think, is going to be the question, right? Brandon Cooks, he hasn't done much of anything this year, but he's a guy that gets the Kansas City Chiefs, Tennessee Titans, Jacksonville Jaguars 5th, 3rd, and 12th most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. This is a guy that might be on your waiver wire right now that you can grab that is going to help you win a championship. He is a guy that, again, maybe you pair. If you've got one of these players that have a harder playoff schedule, you throw out a Brandon Cooks as maybe your wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3, and now you got a guy with a little bit more upside. The Pittsburgh wide receivers have been tough this year to handle. Deontay Johnson continues to do absolutely nothing. George Pickens is the guy in that offense now. He's getting the looks. He's going to have a good matchup against Carolina and a pretty good matchup against Las Vegas with a good matchup against Baltimore in the championship game. He is a guy that might be on waivers right now. The Cleveland wide receivers, Donovan Peoples-Jones, I know for sure is on waivers. He's still under 50% owned in multiple platforms. Amari Cooper is coming off a big game game this week finally. There has been some concern about the way that he performs on the road. Oh, this was a road game, and he seemed to perform just fine. He's going to get Baltimore, he's going to get New Orleans, and he is going to end up getting Washington as well. Those are all going to be good matchups. CeeDee Lamb, 2 of the 3 weeks will be good matchups. He does have a tough one there against Philadelphia right in the middle. And Chris Olave, I think, is a guy that's kind of being overlooked as well. I see a lot of people that are still asking with Chris Olave, are we starting him? He continues to be a start for me. He had a big week this week. I think I had him top 14 wide receivers this week. I really loved his opportunity. He's going to get the Atlanta Falcons. He's going to get Cleveland. And again, yeah, he'll have a tougher week 17 matchup with Philadelphia, but still the schedule that he's got to get there, and being the number one, now having Jarvis Landry back, which I think is good for him. Juwan Johnson is starting to perform well. That's good for him. Hopefully they can run the football a little bit better than what we've seen. That's just going to make Chris Olave an even more dangerous weapon. But he's like maybe like a Deshaun Jackson, right? He's a guy that, yeah, he might not perform, but he's one big play away from giving you all the production that you need, just like Gabe Davis tends to be right now. Those are the guys that, yeah, they are a little bit risky, but that's okay, because we need upside to win fantasy championships. You got to find a good balance of it. Now, some guys with some tough matchups coming up here. Juju Smith-Schuster, I don't love this for him, especially on an offense that spreads the ball around as much as they do. Because if we get ourselves in a position of a tougher matchup against Houston, who quite honestly is very surprising, the 3rd most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, that, they've been pretty good at stopping, but they also get ran on quite a bit. So that's a tough match. Seattle's going to be a tough matchup. Denver is going to be a tough matchup. So for Juju, if he's a guy that you've been relying on, you've probably only been relying on him as a wide receiver too. Now, unfortunately, didn't play this past week with the concussion, but if we can get him back, he is a guy that, because you haven't been relying on him so far, you probably can easily substitute somebody in for him come the playoffs. Justin Jefferson, you can't. You're going to get Indianapolis, you're going to get the New York Giants, and you're going to get the Green Bay Packers. You're going to have back-to-back-to-back tough matchups. You are not going to be able to sit him, and you are not going to be able to get rid of him. Yeah, you could probably get a ton for him, but if you're not going to get anything close to his real value, it doesn't make any sense to trade him. If you're trading him, then yeah, you got to trade for a guy like a Stephon Diggs. You got to trade for a guy like, a CeeDee Lamb, which we just saw a second ago, plus more. You've got to get something that's close to Justin Jefferson, a Tyreek Hill, a Jalen Waddle plus some. You would have to get that. So no, you're probably not trading Justin Jefferson unless you get an absolute haul that you can't say no to. You just got to plan on lower upside those weeks. The Miami wide receivers, I just mentioned maybe you trade for them a second ago. Yes, they've got a difficult schedule. It's not as difficult as what Justin Jefferson is, but we said it a few minutes ago with Tua, right? Tua was going to have a tough schedule to end the season. Buffalo, Green Bay, and New England. These are going to be tough games for the Miami team to go through and win some weeks and go out there and put up fantasy points. They're going to be tested, but I don't care. I'm still going to roll with them. And I guarantee you we're going to get 100 questions in week 15, 16, and 17. Should I start Jalen Waddle? My answer is still going to be, yeah, he's a wide receiver 1. I don't care what the matchup is. We're still starting him. Cincinnati, getting Ja'Marr Chase back would be very helpful for week 15, 16, and 17. It sounds like he's getting a little bit closer to being back, but still, how long is it going to end up being? Tougher matchup with the secondary there in Tampa Bay. Again with New England. Buffalo showing up here again as well. I'm probably not off anybody on Cincinnati. The only person I'd be off on would be Tyler Boyd. And he is a guy that, yeah, I might try to trade right now. Now, not the best performance in the world coming off of this Thursday night matchup. But when you take a look at it overall, maybe you find somebody out there that is willing to say, hey, I need wide receiver help. If we find out, hey, Ja'Marr Chase still a couple of weeks out, you can trade Tyler Boyd in a package to maybe bring you in a little bit of an upgrade somewhere else. Christian Kirk, he's been a guy that we've relied on all offseason. I mean, this is a wide receiver 1, right? Christian Kirk, the money spent on him, people are like, nah, that's no good. I mean, he's earning every penny of it. Dallas might be a little bit tougher, especially if he gets some Travion Diggs. He's going to have the New York Jets, going to be seeing Sauce Gardner, and then Houston. Again, a team that, yeah, the numbers might be a little bit in favor of because they're run on so much, but these two matchups leading into it, we just have to expect, hey, if Christian Kirk doesn't score, the ceiling is going to end up being lower. But the good news is the same thing about Christian Kirk is what I've said about some of these other guys. Christian Kirk, you probably drafted as your wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3. So you might already have someone better in front of him that has a little bit more upside that really helps offset Christian Kirk and is going to put you in a really, really good situation to still win your week. Now, I mentioned it a few minutes ago about tight ends, right? The issue with tight ends is when I went through and I broke it down, even when you look at the guys that have the easiest playoff schedule, like a Travis Kelce, who ranks up there and he's one of the best, here's the issue with that. Even though they have one of the easiest playoff schedules, it's really not that easy because it's a really big mixture of having like one really good matchup, one okay matchup, and one awful matchup, or one really good matchup but 2 awful matchups, but maybe 2 okay matchups and one. So there's not really a good tight end for you to go grab. There also isn't really a tight end that has a really hard playoff schedule, because it's the same thing. It's like a gigantic mixture at the end of the season where you've got up and down games where during the playoff stretch, you might have a guy that's going to have one really good matchup, an okay matchup, and a bad matchup, and we might just need to stream. Now, with that being said, there were 2 guys that did stand out to me, and it was TJ Hockenson and Greg Dulcich. Those 2 seem to be the guys with the best matchup potential heading into the playoffs. Now, Greg Dulcich, maybe after, the performances that we've seen, maybe he falls to the waiver wire for you and you can grab him. A guy like TJ Hockenson, maybe he can be traded for right now. Those are going to be the 2 guys that probably have the best opportunity outside of the big 2 for me, like a Travis Kelce, like a Mark Andrews. And then the other guys like a Pat Freiermuth, a Dalton Schultz, guys like that we can rely on. Hopefully David Njoku's really healthy by then and feeling a lot better. With all of those things, we put ourselves in a situation where we look at it and we say, okay, we might have like a rough week here or there. We need to stream the week. That is a really rough week. So just keep those things in mind as we kind of go through this. That tight end is going to be a little bit more difficult than the other ones because it's just not the same type of matchup. But hey, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it gives you a little bit of a sense of what to look forward to if you have a playoff contending team. Again, we're not running out and we're not trading guys or dropping guys or anything like that based on this video. This is just to help you all prepare as you kind of look forward to the playoffs. Do you need to look for a wide receiver on waivers that maybe has a decent matchup? Do you need to look for a quarterback that you can grab now? Maybe a tight end that you should be grabbing. There's probably not going to be any running backs for you to go out there and grab right now. So you might have to trade for one if your trade deadline has not passed. But hey, do me a favor, before you get out of here, you got to hit the like button for us. It's free. It's easy to do. It helps the channel a ton, and we greatly appreciate it. Subscribe. If you're new here and you're just coming across us here in week 12, it's kind of odd, but hit the subscribe button anyway. Better late than never. And leave me a comment down below if you got any questions. Hopefully you all had a great week 11. Peace out, stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game. Y'all stuck on 3rd down. Your content's plain Jane. Headliners on top now. We gonna move and change. Podcast off the rip. Draft guide, so legit. Fantasy world, our game tight. You know we about that Chubb life. Stuck in a rut and you need some motivation. Head to the channel for this Headliner Nation.
I'm a headliner.